On the 4th floor of St. Auberon Memorial in Providence, there's a rule nobody ever wrote down. When Dorian Ferraro is in the building, the East Corridor stays silent. No music, no laughter. Nobody stands near the last door at the end of the hall. He's 38. He owns half of Federal Hill, and in 4 years nobody in that hospital has seen him smile. Not once. He doesn't raise his voice. He's never had to. At 3 a.m, in the nurse's break room, Zelda Whitfield didn't know he was already upstairs. She's 27. 6 years on that floor, working doubles she can't refuse for bills she can't pay. And she'd just spent 40 minutes watching a first-year nurse sit and shake over a mistake that could end his career before it even started. She couldn't fix it for him, so she did the only thing she had left. She pulled somebody's black coat over her shoulders, picked up a ballpoint pen like it was a scalpel, and dropped her voice as low as it would go. "This IV bag's hanging 2 degrees off-center," she said. "Clearly the entire hospital has to be torn down." Somebody laughed. She pointed the pen at a broken chair in the corner. "And this chair. It's been leaning left for 3 months. Betrayal always starts with small movements." The room broke. The young nurse finally smiled. Then every sound in that room stopped at once. Dorian Ferraro was standing in the doorway, his coat still wet from the rain, 2 men waiting behind him. Zelda set the pen down on the table. She turned around, and she looked up at him. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. And then the man who hadn't smiled in 4 years did something that made his own guards reach inside their coats. He laughed. What happened in that break room would cost one of them everything they had left. If a story about dignity, courage, and second chances is worth your time, hit that like button, share it with someone who needs it tonight, and subscribe so you won't miss what comes next. Now let's go back to that break room at 3 a.m. The laughter died as suddenly as it had burst out. It didn't fade, and there was no final breath at the end. It stopped halfway through, as though someone had reached inside the man standing in the doorway and switched something off. Zelda remained exactly where she was, one hand still resting on the tabletop where she had just set down the pen. She had heard the name Ferraro for 6 years. She had watched department chiefs change their tone whenever they spoke it, but she had never stood 3 steps away from the man who carried it. Dorian entered the break room. He didn't close the door behind him. He didn't look around to see how many people had been laughing. "Did you just accuse a chair of betraying you?" His voice was low and even, neither rising nor falling, like a man rereading the final line of a contract to make certain he hadn't misunderstood it. Zelda considered lying. In the time it took him to walk from the doorway to the center of the room, she had already assembled 3 explanations in her mind. She was practicing a simulated scenario. She was rehearsing her voice for morning rounds. She was repeating something a patient had said. Then she counted the people in the room. 9. 9 people had heard everything from beginning to end, and at least 4 of them had no idea where to hide their faces. "Yes," she said. "I did accuse it." She heard someone behind her draw in a sharp breath. "But it really does lean. It has for 3 months. For the next 3 seconds, nothing happened." Then Zelda saw something she would think about many times in the weeks that followed. The smile on Dorian's face didn't disappear the way a person simply stops smiling. It was removed. And what replaced it wasn't anger. Zelda had worked in intensive care long enough to know the difference between a man who was angry and a man who had just caught himself doing something he had forbidden himself to do a long time ago. He turned his head, very slowly, toward the far end of the East Wing corridor. Toward the door no one was allowed to stand near. He looked at it longer than anyone needed to look at a door. Zelda didn't understand what he was seeing, but she understood that the laughter hadn't been an act of mercy. It had been an accident. And for a man like this, an accident was probably worse than a violation. In the corner of the room, Evan Cordell stood up. He had been sitting motionless for 40 minutes like a man awaiting sentence. And now he was about to open his mouth and say something that would undoubtedly make everything worse. Zelda gave the slightest shake of her head, just once. Evan sat back down. Dorian turned around. He didn't ask why 9 people were standing in the break room at 3 o'clock in the morning instead of being out on the ward. He didn't ask who had given them permission. He didn't ask whose coat was draped over Zelda's shoulders. "Get back to work." 3 words, spoken more quietly than the infusion pump in the next room. Yet the room emptied in 15 seconds. A head nurse passed Zelda without daring to look at her. Evan was the last to leave, and he glanced back once, wearing the expression of someone who had just realized another person was about to pay for his mistake. Zelda took off the black coat, folded it, and placed it over the back of the chair. She did it carefully, as though the neatness of a coat might still save something. The numbers had already begun running through her mind. The shifts she had left that month, the unused vacation days, the payment due on the 15th. She didn't think about defending herself. She thought about how long it would take to find another job that paid the same salary within a distance she could drive there and back in a day. She had already imagined the entire future of losing her job before he spoke again. "What is your name?" "Zelda Whitfield." "How long have you worked on this floor?" 6 years. He nodded once. Not the kind of nod meant to show that he had heard, but the nod of a man who had recorded something and wouldn't need to ask a second time. "Come with me." He turned toward the door without waiting to see whether she would follow. That detail told Zelda more about the man than anything else that night. He didn't give an order twice because it had been a very long time since anyone had forced him to. She followed him into the corridor. The 2 men standing outside moved apart to let them pass. No one spoke to her. No one stopped her. That should have reassured her, but it had the opposite effect. They passed the nurse's station, where 3 people suddenly discovered work that needed doing. They walked toward the end of the east wing, then turned left before reaching the final door. Zelda noticed that Dorian didn't look toward that door again. He avoided it the way a person avoids looking at an old wound on his own body when a stranger is standing nearby. He stopped in front of a room Zelda had never seen anyone enter in all her 6 years of working there. He opened the door, stepped aside, and waited for her to go in first. She crossed the threshold with one thought clearer than any other in her mind. She had just lost her job, and she still hadn't even learned why the man had laughed. The room was smaller than Zelda had imagined. Dorian closed the door and didn't invite her to sit, nor did he sit down himself. He stood 1 step away from the desk, his hands resting at his sides, and waited. Zelda understood that he would stand there waiting until she spoke first, even if it took 10 minutes. "I'm sorry," she said. "I borrowed someone else's coat, imitated you in front of 9 people, and did it during my shift. 3 offenses. I don't intend to minimize any of them." He didn't nod or frown. "Why?" Just 1 word. No preamble, no promise that her answer would be considered with mercy. Zelda realized he wasn't asking because he needed an excuse to punish her. He was asking because he truly didn't know. "There's a first-year nurse named Evan Cordell. He's 24. Tonight, he scanned the wrong code for a dose of medication. She saw him waiting for the rest. No patient was affected. The system stopped it before the medication ever left the cabinet, and he reported it himself within 4 minutes, even though no one required him to. Then where is the problem? The policy. The hospital just introduced a zero-tolerance rule for every error involving medication. There's no classification by severity, and no consideration for whether the person reported it voluntarily. 1 mistake means dismissal, along with a written report sent to the State Board of Nursing. She paused for a moment. "Do you know what a report like that means for someone who has only been working for 11 months? Tell me. It means he'll never work as a nurse again. Not here. Not anywhere in this state. He borrowed $38,000 to finish school, and that debt isn't going anywhere." Zelda heard her voice harden slightly, and she let it stay that way. He sat in the break room for 40 minutes. He didn't eat, didn't drink, and didn't call anyone. I've seen people sit like that in waiting rooms outside surgery. I didn't want to see that look on the face of a 24-year-old because of a dose of medication that never even left the cabinet. Dorian looked at her. "So you imitated me." I distracted him. "You said the chair betrayed me. That was the best part." The words left her mouth before she had time to consider them, and she immediately thought she had just ended everything for herself. But what happened next wasn't anger. Zelda saw it clearly because she was standing directly across from him, and because her profession had trained her to read the smallest changes in another person's face. The corner of his mouth lifted, only a fraction, almost too slight to notice. The kind of movement that comes just before someone laughs. Then he stopped it, not by forcing his face into severity, but by taking a short breath and tightening his jaw, the way a person presses down on something rising inside him. It lasted less than 2 seconds. Zelda pretended not to notice. She also knew she wasn't very good at pretending. "Do you know who I am?" he asked. "I know your name. I know your name is on the plaque outside the East Wing. I know the 4th floor goes quiet when you arrive." "What else?" "Nothing." She was telling the truth. "I work in intensive care. I know my patients, and I know the schedule. Beyond that, I don't know anything about you, and I've never asked. He took in that answer and remained silent longer than she expected. 6 years, he said, and you've never asked. They pay me to ask questions about patients, not donors. As she waited for him to continue, Zelda let her eyes move around the room, and that was when she noticed something strange. Rooms reserved for donors were usually covered with plaques of recognition, photographs from ribbon-cutting ceremonies, and framed displays holding enlarged checks. There was nothing like that here. There was only one framed photograph hanging on the wall across from the window. It showed a young woman wearing pediatric nursing scrubs, the kind printed with cartoon figures that only the second-floor staff wore. She was laughing, one hand holding a plastic stethoscope made for children, her head tilted slightly as though she had just said something very funny to the person behind the camera. The frame hung a little lower than normal eye level. Zelda realized why a moment later. It had been placed at the height of someone who was sitting down. She looked away from the photograph, but one moment too slowly to be discreet. Dorian had seen her. He didn't turn his head toward the wall. He only spoke, and his voice changed slightly, not softer, but thinner, like a wire being pulled tighter. What are you looking at? Zelda considered lying for the second time that night. This time there were no 9 witnesses, only the 2 of them in a room with the door closed, and that was precisely what made lying harder rather than easier. The photograph, she said. She's the only other person in this room. Dorian didn't answer immediately. He stepped closer to the desk, placed one hand on the wooden surface, and Zelda realized that he was deciding something far greater than whether she would lose her job. My younger sister, he said. Bianca. Zelda didn't ask anything more. She had learned that when someone opened a door on their own, the worst thing you could do was push it wider. She worked here, Dorian continued. 2nd floor, pediatrics, 4 years and 3 months. He spoke those numbers as though he were reading from a file, and Zelda understood that it was the only way he could say them aloud. She was 26. Zelda remained still. In the hallway, the wheels of a cart rolled past, then faded into silence. On the night of October 17th, 4 years ago, he said. She finished her shift at 2 o'clock in the morning. That's why I was in the building tonight. It was her anniversary. A car struck her just outside the emergency entrance. The police never found the vehicle. Zelda gave a single, very slight nod. She didn't say she was sorry, because in 6 years of working in intensive care, she had heard those words spoken thousands of times and had never once seen them help anyone. She used to imitate me, Dorian said. His voice dropped much lower, almost as though he were speaking only for himself. At home, she was the only one who dared. She would sit in my chair, lower her voice, and declare that some lifeless object was a traitor. Once it was the desk lamp, once it was the coffee maker. She said the coffee maker had been secretly communicating with my rival. A chill moved down Zelda's spine. She finally understood why the laughter in the break room had been stripped from his face so quickly. She hadn't made him laugh because she was funny. She had accidentally opened a door she hadn't even known existed. I didn't know, she said. I know you didn't. He looked down at the desk. That night, I was supposed to pick her up. I told her 2 o'clock, at the emergency entrance. I arrived at 2:11. He stopped. 11 minutes. Zelda said nothing. She had seen enough to know that there were very small stretches of time people carried with them for the rest of their lives, and no calculation could ever make them shorter. After that night, I stopped laughing, he said. Not because I forced myself to. It simply disappeared. Then, when it came back, I discovered that it didn't feel like something good. It felt as though I were taking something that didn't belong to me. He raised his eyes to hers. Tonight I laughed because of her, not because of you. Do you understand? I understand. You don't feel insulted? No. I feel relieved. She saw his brow tighten slightly, so she continued, because that means you weren't laughing at a nurse pretending to be a crime boss. You were laughing at someone you miss. The second one feels much better. Zelda paused, considered her next words, then said something she wouldn't have said to any other donor in that building. Don't expect me to tell you to move on. I won't say that. Why? Because it means nothing, and because I don't think your problem is that you haven't moved on. She rested one hand on the back of the chair. Pain has a cruel habit. It turns every good feeling into betrayal. You laugh once, and immediately some part of you says you've just left her behind. So the next time, you won't laugh. And the time after that, you won't either. Until you begin to believe that silence is loyalty, when really it's only a habit. The room remained quiet for a long time. Zelda could clearly hear the air conditioner running. You speak like someone who has tried it, Dorian said. How do you know? Zelda could have said no, and everything would have ended there. She didn't. 3 years ago, my father died on the 6th floor of this building, she said. Pancreatic cancer. I worked nights in intensive care, then went upstairs to sit with him in the morning. I did that for 4 months. After he died, I took extra weekend shifts with a home care service, and I still owe $41,000 for his treatment. She spoke in an ordinary voice, the same voice she used when reading vital signs. My mother is 59. She has young-onset Alzheimer's disease. She lives in a memory care facility, and every month I have to calculate whether I'll still be able to afford it the next month. Dorian said nothing. He didn't offer comfort, and he didn't ask another question about the money, and Zelda was grateful to him for both. During those 4 months, I still made jokes, she said. I joked with my coworkers. I joked with my own father 3 days before he could no longer speak. Someone in the department thought I was heartless. One woman said it directly to my face. What did you say to her? I didn't answer, but I knew the answer. She looked straight at him. If I stop laughing every time life hurts me, then life is the only one left having any fun. Dorian stood motionless. For 4 years, people had said many things to him about loss, most of them people who were paid to speak. Not one of them had ever given him a sentence they themselves had paid a price to learn. He watched her for a long moment, then said, Are you working tomorrow night? Yes. Then go home and sleep. You have 5 hours. He opened the door for her, and Zelda stepped into the hallway with the strange feeling that she had just been allowed to keep her job, even though no one had said so aloud. She wouldn't understand how important that night had been until 36 hours later, when her name appeared somewhere it should never have appeared. Zelda slept for 3.5 of the 5 hours he had given her. By 7 o'clock that morning, she was sitting in her car in the parking lot of Brightmoor Residence, eating a sandwich she had bought at a gas station and waiting for visiting hours to begin. She came here 4 mornings a week, always after a night shift, because it was the only time of day that didn't cost her another shift somewhere else. Ellen Whitfield was 59 years old, and over the past 2 years, she had gradually forgotten her life in reverse order, beginning with the newest things. That morning, she remembered her husband's name, remembered the name of the neighbor's dog back in 1994, and called Zelda the brown-haired nurse. Zelda brushed her hair, checked the red patch on her heel, wrote it down in her private notebook, then read the note aloud to the morning nurse. She did it out of professional instinct, not self-pity. Brightmoor cost $7,200 a month. Zelda's salary, even with double shifts and weekend work for the home care service, didn't cover half of it. 2 years earlier, a social worker had handed her an 11-page application for financial assistance, and Zelda had filled it out at 4 o'clock in the morning in the break room, between 2 rounds of patient checks. 3 weeks later, part of the cost began to be covered by an organization called the Ferraro Civic Trust. Zelda didn't know who stood behind that name, and she didn't ask. In the records, it was nothing more than a line under payment source. She had earned an associate degree in nursing because 4 years of college was something her family couldn't afford, then completed the rest of her education through an online program over 3 years, mostly during quiet hours on night shifts. She still owed $41,000 for her father's medical treatment. She kept a notebook with the due date of every payment, and she had never been late on a single one. At 4 o'clock that afternoon, she arrived on the 4th floor, 20 minutes before shift change, just as she always did. The head nurse handed her a stack of printed pages and didn't meet her eyes. This came in, she said. Administration just sent it down. It was a list of terminated payments. The Ferraro Civic Trust had announced that it was ending financial support for 34 long-term patients at St. Auberon Memorial Hospital and Brightmoor Residence, effective in 14 days. At the bottom of the page was an electronic signature, along with an approval code and a full name. Dorian Ferraro. Zelda read the name twice. The night before, she had stood 3 steps away from that man and listened to him speak about his sister. She thought about calling administration for an explanation, then looked at the clock and understood that she didn't have time. 7 of the 34 patients were on her floor. Someone would have to enter each room and tell them. Who is giving them the news? She asked. The head nurse still wouldn't look at her. Administration says it falls to the nurse in charge. Zelda folded the papers, tucked them beneath her arm, and began walking. The first room belonged to an 81-year-old man with end-stage heart failure. He was asleep, and his daughter was sitting beside him. After hearing the news, the daughter nodded, then asked whether she could sign the papers to take her father home early so they wouldn't have to pay for the remaining 14 days. The second room belonged to a 73-year-old woman with no relatives listed in her file. She asked Zelda who had made the decision, and Zelda told her honestly that she didn't know. The third room, the fourth, the fifth. Zelda repeated the same sentences at the same pace, and each time she had to wait several seconds before leaving so the person inside had time to ask again. The final room at the end of the hall belonged to Harriet Sloan, 68 years old, a retired elementary school teacher who had spent 39 years in the classroom and had been receiving long-term care since spring. She was sitting upright against her pillows, holding a paperback book with a folded corner, and she smiled when Zelda entered. "You're earlier than usual. I have something I need to tell you." Zelda pulled the chair closer and sat down at eye level, because that was what she always did when she had to say something difficult. She read the decision aloud, slowly, without using a single technical term. Harriet listened to the end. She didn't interrupt. When Zelda finished, Harriet placed the book on the blanket and carefully smoothed the open page, as though it were the most important thing in the room at that moment. "So, 2 weeks from now," she said. "Yes." Harriet nodded. She looked toward the window for a while, then turned back. "Zelda." "Yes? Does that mean I have to go home?" Zelda opened her mouth to answer. Then she remembered. 3 years earlier, to pay for 6 rounds of chemotherapy, Harriet Sloan had sold the house where she had lived for 41 years. Zelda told Harriet that she didn't know yet, that she would ask again, and that Harriet shouldn't pack anything until Zelda came back and spoke to her once more. Harriet nodded and picked up her book. Zelda left the room, walked straight into the medication room, closed the door, and for the first time during that shift, she opened the packet and read it from beginning to end, instead of looking only at the section related to her floor. The list was arranged alphabetically by facility, then by record number. She moved past the names of the people she had just met, then reached the Brightmoor section in the second half. Number 27, number 28, number 29, Ellen Whitfield. Zelda stood perfectly still. There was no voice in her head, only a very specific sensation in her chest, like the moment an alarm begins sounding and you haven't yet figured out which patient it belongs to. She sat down on the stool in the medication room with the papers resting on her lap, and for nearly 4 minutes, she did nothing at all. She could see 2 paths before her with absolute clarity. The first was silence. If she said nothing, there might be a review. There might be an exception. A nurse who had worked there for 6 years and whose job had been spared by the head of the trust himself the night before might be removed from the list. One place. One person. Her mother. The second path was to speak, and if she spoke, she would speak for all 34 people, including those she had never met at Brightmoor, including the 81-year-old man in the first room, including Harriet Sloan, and in that case, she would no longer be in any position to ask for an exception for anyone. Zelda placed the papers on the table. She didn't call anyone. She didn't send anyone a message. She logged into the computer in the medication room with her own account and opened the section that most nurses never touched. The hospital's electronic medical record system recorded every action in an audit log, 1 line for every time someone viewed, edited, created, or approved a document. Each line included a user code, a device, and a timestamp accurate to the minute. It had been built for inspectors, not for night shift nurses, but access was available to both. Zelda searched for the identification number on the decision ending the payments. The document had been created at 3:06 in the morning on October 18th. She looked at the time and sat up straighter. 3:06 in the morning on October 18th was exactly 20 minutes before Dorian Ferraro had entered the nurse's break room on the 4th floor. She remembered precisely because she had looked at the clock 3 times that night. She remembered him standing in the doorway with rain still wet on his coat. She remembered that he hadn't been holding a phone, either in the break room or later in the donor room, and she remembered it clearly because he had been the only person in the building that night who wasn't looking at a screen. Zelda opened the device information. The document hadn't been created from a phone or an outside application. It had been created from a fixed workstation inside the hospital's internal system. She wrote the workstation code in her private notebook, along with the hour, the minute, and the document number, using the same block lettering she used when recording medication doses. Then she called the security office. She didn't explain why. She asked only the single question that a nurse was permitted to ask under procedure. Had the East Wing hallway cameras recorded continuously during the night of October 17th into the morning of October 18th? The officer on duty said yes. The system ran continuously, and the footage was stored for at least 90 days. Zelda thanked him and hung up. She remained seated for a while longer. She understood exactly what she had found. A man couldn't stand motionless in the fourth-floor hallway beneath a camera, holding nothing in his hands, while at the same time sitting at a workstation somewhere else, approving a decision to cut financial support for 34 patients. One of those two things was false. And Zelda was the only person in the building who knew both, because she was the only person who had happened to be present in both places on the same night. She printed the document. Then she pressed print a second time. She carried 2 identical copies out of the medication room, folded one into quarters, went down to the basement changing room, opened her personal locker, and slipped it between the final 2 pages of the notebook she kept there. She locked the door, checked the handle once, then went back upstairs. She clipped the other copy inside the shift records. 40 minutes later, she stopped by Harriet Sloane's room for the second time that night. Harriet had turned off her reading lamp. "You're still awake?" "Yes. I'm thinking." "Don't think anymore. Tomorrow, I'm going to get an answer." Harriet watched her for a moment in the darkness. "Are you sure you should ask?" "No," Zelda said, "but I'm going to ask." 34 names rested in the packet beneath her arm, and the 29th name belonged to her mother. Zelda's shift ended at 7:15 in the morning, and she didn't go home. She drove to Federal Hill, parked 2 blocks from the Ferraro Group building, and sat in her car for 10 minutes to make sure her hands wouldn't shake when she held out the papers. Then she went inside. The lobby attendant stopped her the moment she passed through the revolving door. He asked whether she had an appointment. "No." "Then I can't help you." "Just call upstairs and say one sentence exactly as I give it to you," Zelda said. "A nurse from St. Auberon is holding an order bearing Mr. Ferraro's signature, and he never signed it." The lobby attendant looked at her. She was still wearing her night shift uniform, her hair tied back, and she held a stack of printed pages inside a plastic folder. He picked up the phone. The call lasted less than 20 seconds. He put the receiver down and told her to take the elevator on the right. Upstairs, a man was already waiting outside the elevator doors. He was about 40, with the posture of someone who had once served in the military, and Zelda immediately recognized him as one of the 2 men who had stood behind Dorian on the 4th floor the night before. "Nico Barsanti," he said. He didn't offer his hand or ask another question. He simply turned and led the way. Dorian was standing beside his desk when she entered. He didn't seem surprised to see her, and he didn't ask how she knew the address. He only held out his hand. Zelda placed the papers in it. He read them. Zelda watched him read, and she realized that he read like a man accustomed to searching documents for errors, his eyes stopping at the bottom of the page where the approval code and timestamp appeared. When he finished, he returned to the beginning and read the entire thing a second time. "Where did you get this?" "Administration sent it to the 4th floor yesterday afternoon. I was the one who had to go into each room and tell them." "How many people?" 34. 7 on my floor, the other 27 at Brightmoor." "When does it take effect?" 14 days. Dorian set the papers down. "I didn't sign this." "I know." He looked up. "How do you know?" "Because the document was created at 3:06 in the morning on October 18th, from a fixed workstation inside the internal system." Zelda continued in the same voice she used when reading vital signs. 20 minutes later, you walked into the nurse's break room on the 4th floor. You weren't holding a phone. The East Wing hallway cameras recorded continuously that night, and the footage is stored for at least 90 days. You couldn't have been in 2 places at once. No one in the room spoke for about 5 seconds. Then Dorian turned to Nico. "Call Klein." Nico dialed. Zelda heard every word because Dorian didn't leave his place, and didn't tell her to step outside. Nico informed the hospital director that the order bearing that identification number was suspended immediately, that no further notice was to be sent to any patient or relative from that moment forward, and that the 7 files on the 4th floor had to be restored to active payment status before the end of the day. There wasn't a single threat in the call. None was necessary. The second call went to Brightmoor. The third went to the Trust's finance department, with instructions to place an immediate hold on every pending payment authorization and every pending termination of payment, without exception. Zelda looked at the clock on the wall, when Nico put down the phone for the last time. 40 minutes had passed since she handed over the papers. 34 people weren't going to lose their beds, and none of them would ever know how close it had come to happening. "Sit down," Dorian said. Zelda sat. He remained standing. He picked up the papers again, turned to the final page, and stared at the electronic signature for a long time. Zelda understood that he wasn't reading anymore. He was calculating. "Have you told anyone about this?" "No." "Did you print another copy?" Zelda considered her answer for exactly one beat. "Yes, one copy. It's in my personal locker in the basement." She saw Nico turn his head slightly. Dorian didn't. "Good," he said. "Don't take it out of there." He placed the papers on the desk and looked at her. Two things were happening in his mind at once, and Zelda knew neither of them. The first was that 36 hours earlier, the woman sitting in front of him had made him laugh for the first time in 4 years. The second was that the same woman had just brought him proof that someone was using his identity to issue orders, and had done it smoothly enough to pass through the entire approval process of a trust bearing his family's name, without a single person in the system stopping to ask a question. He thought about that longer than he wanted to, because if the process hadn't stopped this time, then there was a very good chance it had never stopped the times before. "Miss Whitfield." "Yes." "Are you working tonight?" "Yes, 7 o'clock. "Then you have almost 10 hours. He looked toward the door. "Close it behind you." Zelda stood, walked out, and pulled the door shut behind her. She descended to the lobby, believing that everything had been resolved in 40 minutes. She didn't yet know that what she had placed on his desk wasn't a single mistake, but the first piece of a chain, and that someone had been speaking in Dorian Ferraro's voice inside that building for a very long time. 2 days later, Dorian summoned her upstairs again. This time he was seated, and he came straight to the point. "I need to know how many directives have been issued in my name that I never signed." "The past 2 years. The entire trust system, along with every related part of the hospital administration." "You already have people who can do that." "I have 7 people capable of doing it. 6 of them sat in meetings where those directives were read aloud, and not one of them asked a question. The 7th is Nico, and Nico can't read medical records." He pushed a sheet of paper toward her. "Name the compensation you want." Zelda didn't pick it up. "I won't take money." "Why?" "Because if you pay me, then the results I give you will only be worth the amount you paid. I want them to be worth more than that." She placed both hands on the desk. "I want 3 things." "Say them." "First, full access to the audit logs, not only the medical records section, but also finance and vendor contracts. I need to see user codes and timestamps. I don't need to see the money." "Second, the right to question people. I need to be able to speak directly to department heads, not send questions through secretaries and wait 3 weeks. "Third, a formal letter of appointment that clearly states the scope of the work, the duration, and approval by the hospital board recorded in the meeting minutes." Dorian looked at her. "You don't trust me?" "I trust you." "I don't trust this situation," Zelda continued without looking away. "If I go around asking questions simply because you told me to, then 6 months from now people will say I'm a nurse favored by a crime boss who gave herself permission to search through records. But if there's a formal document, then they'll have to argue with the board, not with me." He remained silent for a moment, then nodded. "Anything else?" "Yes." Zelda opened her bag, took out a typed document, and placed it on the desk. "I need you to read this before you sign anything." Dorian picked it up. It was a conflict of interest disclosure written in the proper format, with her full name, professional license number, and 3 short paragraphs. Ellen Whitfield, 59 years old, was the declarant's biological mother. For the past 2 years, part of her expenses at Brightmoor residence had been paid by the Ferraro Civic Trust. At the time the application for assistance was submitted, the declarant didn't know who stood behind the trust. For that reason, the declarant requested that every record connected to Brightmoor be reviewed and approved by someone else, and that the declarant be permitted to read those files but not draw conclusions about that group of records. Dorian read the entire document, then read the final paragraph again. "You wrote this yourself?" "Yes. No one asked you to." "No. You understand that you've just handed me something anyone could use to remove you from this review?" "I understand." Zelda held his gaze. "But if I don't disclose it myself, someone else will disclose it for me, and then it won't be a declaration anymore. It'll become a discovery." Dorian set the paper down, called Nico into the room, and told him to send both documents to legal before the end of the day. 3 days later, the board of St. Auberon Memorial Hospital approved the appointment with 6 votes in favor and 1 abstention. Zelda Whitfield was named Interim Compliance Review Coordinator for a period of 90 days, with authority limited to comparing directives against audit logs and no authority to approve expenditures. She continued working 3 shifts a week on the 4th floor because she had asked to. Over the next 11 days, Zelda didn't uncover a single theft. She uncovered a shape. 7 medical supply vendors had been added to the approved list within 18 months, and their prices were 300% above the market average for the most basic items, the kind of supplies used every day that no one noticed because each individual price was small. Not one of those contracts had been open to competitive bidding. Every one had been signed under an abbreviated approval process reserved for emergencies. The Fund for Uninsured Patients, established to cover emergency cases whose medical bills couldn't be recovered, had been drained to almost nothing within a year, and the ledger described it only as an internal transfer. 19 patients who had once been supported by that fund had their accounts transferred to a debt collection company. Zelda read their names. She recognized 2 of them, and 3 nurses had been reassigned to other facilities within 6 weeks of submitting written questions about discrepancies in the inventory of pain medication. All 3 transfers were recorded as staffing needs. All 3 had been approved under Dorian Ferraro's name. Zelda didn't write a single conclusion. She created a table, 1 directive per line, 1 timestamp per line, and left the final column blank. That column was titled User Code of Document Creator. She needed access 1 level deeper before she could fill it in, and she submitted the request on Tuesday afternoon. On Wednesday morning, someone entered her office without knocking. He was well into his 50s, with hair that had gone almost entirely gray, and he entered the room with the manner of a man who hadn't needed to knock on a single door anywhere in that building for 16 years. "Miss Whitfield." He pulled out the chair and sat down before she had a chance to invite him. "Aldo Renzi. I serve as an advisor to the Ferraro family, and I oversee the financial side of the trust." Zelda closed the file in front of her without hurrying and folded the cover down over it. "I'm waiting for additional access privileges. I assume that's why you're here. I'm here because of you." He said it in a warm, measured voice, the kind people used when sitting beside a hospital bed. "I know what happened on the night of the 17th. The whole building knows. You made him laugh." Zelda didn't answer. "It had been 4 years," Aldo said. "I sat beside him in the funeral home that day. I was the one who signed the papers for him because he couldn't hold a pen. So when I heard that someone had made him laugh, my first reaction was relief." He paused in exactly the right place. "My second was concern." "Concern about what?" "About you." He rested his elbows on his knees and leaned forward slightly. "Miss Whitfield, I've been doing this for a long time. I've seen good people placed somewhere they were never meant to be, and I've seen how it ended. You made him laugh, and I understand why that might have confused you about your position. It's a very natural mistake." "What is my position?" "You're a nurse who watches over patients." He smiled, without a trace of cruelty. "They don't audit trusts." Zelda looked at him. In 6 years of working in intensive care, she had met plenty of people who spoke to her in that tone, most of them second-year residents, but no one had ever done it with this much kindness. "Fortunately, I'm not auditing a trust," she said. "I'm tracking time, and time doesn't know how to lie for anyone." Aldo's smile didn't change, but the silence before he continued lasted longer than a natural pause. "Do you know the problem with timestamps? They don't tell you what happened. They only tell you what a computer thinks. Our system is older than you realize. The synchronization drifts. Login sessions stay open. One person leaves a workstation running, and someone else walks past and presses a key." He opened his hands. "I've seen 3 reviews begin with timestamps and end with apologies. Then this one will be the 4th, Zelda said. "Or it won't." Aldo rose. He carefully pushed the chair back into exactly the position where he had found it, then stood beside the door for another moment. "I'm saying this as someone older than you, and you're free to ignore it." His voice lowered until it was almost gentle. "That man has been in pain for 4 years. When someone has suffered that long, they become very vulnerable to anyone who knows how to comfort them at the right moment. They don't realize it. Then one day they do, and when that day comes, they forgive no one, not even the person who comforted them." He inclined his head. "I hope your work goes well." The door closed. Zelda remained still for about 5 seconds. Then she opened her notebook, turned to a blank page, and wrote in the same block lettering she used for medication doses. Date. Name. 9:14 in the morning. Entered room without knocking. 9:21 in the morning. Left room. Content summarized in 4 lines, without a single comment added. She closed the notebook, placed it in her bag, and returned to her table. That afternoon, Level 2 access was granted. By nearly 11 o'clock that night, she had completed the final column. 7 vendor contracts, signed at scattered points across 18 months, at 4 different times, through 3 different departments. 7 lines, and the user code column contained only 1 value. The same account had opened, edited, and pushed all 7 files through the abbreviated approval process. Zelda searched for the account in the internal directory. She read the name that appeared on the screen, then opened her notebook, turned back to the page she had written that morning, and placed the 2 beside each other. 9:14 in the morning. 4 hours earlier, the man bearing that name had sat in a chair about 5 feet from where she was sitting now, and told her that timestamps couldn't tell anyone what had happened. Zelda didn't print anything. She remained seated for a while longer, then remembered something the Information Technology Department had mentioned during the mandatory training session in March, the session where nearly everyone in the department had struggled to stay awake. Every day at 2 o'clock in the morning, the system created a complete snapshot of all data, stored it in a separate location, and that snapshot couldn't be altered afterward. She wrote 1 more line in her notebook, closed it, and shut down the computer. On the floor below, the light in one office was still burning. On Friday morning, every department head and head nurse at St. Auberon Memorial Hospital was summoned to the large conference room on the 5th floor. The invitation had been sent at 10 o'clock the night before, with no agenda attached. 27 people were present. Zelda sat in the row of chairs against the wall, not at the table. She had attended 4 meetings like this in 6 years, and all 4 had followed the same pattern. Aldo Renzi sat at the head of the table, read out the decisions, explained the reasons, and answered questions. Dorian Ferraro sat at the far end of the table and said nothing. People called that approval. For years, no one in that room had thought otherwise. This time, Dorian stood before Aldo could open his folder. He didn't walk to the podium. He simply rose where he had been sitting. Over the past 2 years, directives have been issued in my name that I didn't sign, he said. I don't know how many. We're counting them. The room went silent. No one looked at anyone else. If anyone here has ever received an order that seemed wrong and carried it out because my name was on it, I need to hear about it. Today, in this room. He paused. No one will be disciplined for speaking. I'm saying that once, and I'll stand by it. No one moved. Zelda looked along the rows of seats. She knew that at least 5 people in the room had something to tell, because she had read their names in her table 3 days earlier. But fear in that building wasn't something that could be dismantled with a single assurance. It had been built over many years, 1 brick at a time, and most of those bricks bore the signature of the man now standing before them. 15 seconds passed. Aldo Renzi leaned forward slightly, preparing to say something that would bring the matter to a polite close. In the last row, a hand went up. Zelda turned around. Evan Cordell stood. He was the youngest person in the room, and the only one whose name badge carried no title. He had been sent to attend because his department head was on duty. His hand was trembling, and he knew it was trembling, so he gripped the back of the chair in front of him. I have. His voice broke on the second word. He cleared his throat and said it again. I have. Go on, Dorian said. In August of last year, Mr. Kessler called me down to the compliance office. He gave me an inventory sheet for pain medication from the second-floor storage room and told me to re-enter the numbers so they matched the report. Evan spoke quickly, as though he feared that if he slowed down, he would stop altogether. The actual count was short by 42 vials. He said it was a system error and that I only needed to correct the figures so they matched. Did you change them? Yes. Evan looked down. I did. Why? Because I had only been working for 6 weeks, and because he said that if I didn't change them, the report would reach you, and you would deal with me. He raised his head and spoke the final sentence clearly. He said Mr. Ferraro would deal with you. No one in the room seemed to breathe. Dorian didn't move. Sit down, he said. His voice hadn't changed at all, but Zelda saw the hand resting on the back of his chair tighten slightly. A head nurse seated midway down the table raised her hand next. She spoke about 3 members of her staff, who had been transferred after submitting written questions about that same storage room, and about being reminded that questions like those shouldn't be put in writing. The head of social services spoke after her, about 19 patient accounts that had been transferred to a debt collection company, and about how she had sent 2 letters of objection before giving up, because the second letter had been answered with a single sentence, stating that the decision had been approved at the highest level. A pharmacist stood and spoke about the 7 new vendors, and about how he had stopped asking questions after the 3rd time. Each person finished speaking and sat down, and every time another hand rose, none of them sounded angry. That was the hardest part to hear. They told their stories like people describing the weather. For 40 minutes, Dorian didn't interrupt anyone. Zelda sat against the wall and watched him. She understood that he wasn't listening to stories about Aldo Renzi. He was listening to stories about himself. Every account had the same structure. Someone had issued a cruel order, attached his name to it, and not one of the 27 people sitting there had felt the need to verify it, because they believed it. Because to them, the order sounded exactly like him. When the last person sat down, the conference room remained silent for a long time. Dorian stepped away from his seat and stood at the head of the table, a place where he hadn't stood once in 4 years. "I'm sorry." 3 words, and nothing more. No explanation, no promise, no mention of who had done it. 27 people sat motionless. Zelda looked around and realized that not one person in the room knew how to respond, because no one had ever prepared for that possibility. Then Dorian added one final sentence. "Beginning today, anyone may request written confirmation of any directive issued in my name. No reason is required. No one will be asked why." He left the conference room first. At the opposite end of the table, Aldo Renzi remained seated, his folder still unopened, smiling at the person beside him as though he had just attended an ordinary meeting. Zelda saw him again in the 3rd-floor corridor, nearly an hour after the meeting had ended. He was standing there alone, and she had the feeling he had been standing there for almost that entire hour. "Come with me," he said. He led her down to the 2nd floor, turned into a side corridor that was now used only for storage, and stopped in front of a door marked Nurse's Changing Room. He unlocked it with his own key. Inside, most of the lockers had already had their nameplates removed. He walked straight to the 2nd row and stopped in front of locker number 214. The nameplate was still fixed to the door. Bianca Ferraro. "No one has opened it in 4 years, Dorian said. "The hospital asked 3 times. I refused 3 times. Zelda didn't ask why. She looked at the sheet of paper taped beneath the nameplate. It was a homemade certificate, with the kind of cheap decorative border that came preloaded in office software, and the words in the center were printed in bold. "Chair of Unnecessary Opinions." Beneath that was a smaller line with a date and a scrawled signature. She gave it to herself, Dorian said. There was a budget meeting that year, a very long one. She was invited because she represented pediatrics. At the 40-minute mark, she raised her hand and asked to speak, then announced to the entire room that the conference table was far too serious to be trusted, and suggested that the statement be entered into the minutes. Did they put it in? No, but 3 days later, this appeared on her locker. Zelda studied the certificate for another moment. Do you know why she did it? Because she liked provoking me. I don't think so. Zelda turned toward him. Were you in that meeting? Dorian was silent for one beat. Yes. Then she wasn't provoking you. She was telling everyone in the room that someone was allowed to open their mouth. Zelda continued in an ordinary voice. This morning, I sat in the 5th floor conference room and counted. 27 people were present. It took 15 seconds, and a 24-year-old nurse before the first person raised a hand. She probably would have found that difficult to understand. What are you saying? I'm saying that for the past 4 years, inside the building where your sister once appointed herself chair of opinions, you allowed exactly one man to become the only person permitted to have one. Dorian opened his mouth to object. Zelda saw it clearly, saw the answer already taking shape on his face. Then he stopped. He looked at the certificate, and he laughed. This time, nothing burst out. It was only a short breath through his nose, accompanied by the slight lift of one corner of his mouth. The laugh of a man who had just been seen through and knew he couldn't argue his way out of it. Zelda waited to see whether he would remove it as he had before. He didn't. He allowed it to remain for several seconds. Then it faded on its own, and he didn't tighten his jaw, didn't draw in a breath, didn't do anything to punish himself for having laughed. Zelda said nothing about it. She thought that if she did, It might never happen a third time. Miss Whitfield. Yes. Beginning today, I'm assigning someone to accompany you, at the hospital, and when you go home. No. He turned to look at her. Do you understand who Renzi is? I understand that he was the only person who opened all 7 of those contracts, Zelda said. And I understand that he sat in my office on Wednesday and told me timestamps couldn't be trusted. She continued before he could answer. But if you assign someone to follow me, then when I present my findings in 2 weeks, the first question people ask won't be whether the findings are true or false. The first question will be why a nurse has a bodyguard. Then what do you want? 3 things, just like last time. Zelda raised one finger. First, my access remains unchanged, even if someone requests that it be withdrawn. Second, my right to question people remains unchanged, even if the person I need to question is Mr. Renzi. She paused. The third is harder than the other 2. Say it. When I present my findings, don't defend me. Dorian frowned. If you defend me, I become your person. But if I present the evidence, and you remain silent, while the board checks every line for themselves, then I become the person with proof. Zelda looked directly at him. And I need you to listen to me without deciding that I'm being emotional. People say that to female nurses often. It's very convenient, because it allows the listener to avoid answering the question. Dorian was silent for quite a long time. Are you afraid? Yes. He hadn't expected that answer. But being afraid doesn't mean he's right, she said. He nodded once. All right. Then he locked the changing room door, and they walked back toward the main corridor. Inside Zelda's bag was her table, with all 7 lines now complete in the final column. She could take it before the board on Monday morning. She also knew that 7 contracts weren't enough to prove where the money had gone, and that if she submitted the evidence too soon, Aldo would have time to explain away every line. But every day she waited created another possibility that someone would be forced out of a hospital bed. Zelda decided to wait another 10 days. She didn't use all 10. On Monday morning, Aldo Renzi submitted a 2-page petition to the hospital board. It said nothing about the contracts, nothing about the audit, and not one sentence carried the tone of an attack. It merely included an attached document, and that document was the conflict of interest, disclosure Zelda Whitfield herself had written and signed, confirming that her biological mother was a beneficiary of the Ferraro Civic Trust. Aldo wrote that he greatly valued Miss Whitfield's honesty. He wrote that it was precisely because of that honesty that the board had an obligation to act. He recommended suspending the financial assistance provided to Ellen Whitfield for the entire duration of the review, to ensure that the person conducting the review didn't benefit from the trust she was examining. The petition ended with a sentence stating that the assistance would be considered for reinstatement once the work was complete. The board approved it that same afternoon. Dorian read the decision at 4 o'clock. He called legal counsel, and they told him exactly one thing. If he intervened to preserve the assistance, he would prove with his own hands that the reviewer was being protected by him, and the entire review would lose its value before any board that examined it. He put down the phone and didn't intervene. At 10 o'clock Tuesday morning, the Rhode Island Board of Nursing received an anonymous complaint. It accused registered nurse Zelda Whitfield of diverting pain medication from the 4th-floor intensive care supply room over a period of 14 months. Attached to the complaint was an extract from the medication scanning log, printed directly from the system, showing her name and employee code on 23 withdrawals. 9 of those 23 withdrawals had occurred during shifts when her name didn't appear on the staffing schedule. Under regulations, when an allegation involving controlled substances was supported by documentary evidence, the board had the authority to issue a temporary suspension before conducting an investigation. The order was signed at 11:40. Zelda was making rounds when the internal phone system summoned her to the 5th floor. Theodore Klein, the hospital director, sat behind his desk with 2 representatives from Human Resources standing on either side of him. He read the order aloud from beginning to end, omitting nothing, and never raised his eyes while doing it. Then he said that under hospital policy, anyone whose license had been suspended couldn't continue having contact with patients, couldn't enter any treatment area, and couldn't retain access to the hospital system. He said her position as interim compliance review coordinator was also suspended pending the outcome of the investigation. He asked whether she had any questions. Zelda asked one. Who filed the complaint? It was anonymous. Then who supplied the medication scanning log attached to it? No one outside the hospital could have obtained that. Klein looked down at the papers before him. I don't have that information. Zelda didn't ask anything else. She placed her employee badge on the desk. One of the human resources representatives picked it up, passed it over a scanner, and a message appeared on the screen stating that the badge had been deactivated. It happened in 3 seconds, and no one in the room said a word. That same afternoon, Ray Kessler, head of the Trust's compliance department, forwarded the entire file to the Rhode Island Attorney General's office, accompanied by a formal letter stating that the hospital had discovered evidence of controlled substance diversion and was legally obligated to report it. Every detail of that letter followed procedure, down to the final period. Zelda was escorted downstairs in the staff elevator. No one touched her. One human resources representative walked ahead of her, the other behind, and they maintained a distance of 3 steps, exactly as the guidelines required. She passed the 4th floor nurses' station at 12:18, in the middle of her own shift. 2 coworkers standing there turned away. Another looked directly at her and didn't know what to say, so said nothing. At the far end of the corridor, Evan Cordell stopped halfway across the hall with a stack of patient charts in his hands and watched her. Zelda gave the slightest shake of her head, just once, exactly as she had in the break room 3 weeks earlier. He remained where he was. She was still wearing her uniform. No one told her to change, and she didn't ask. When she reached the parking lot, she opened her car door, sat down, and didn't start the engine right away. She took her notebook from her bag, opened it to a blank page, and began writing. Date. Time the suspension order was received. Time her badge was taken. The names of the 3 people present in the room. The exact question she had asked and the exact answer she had received. She recorded everything in the same block lettering she used for medication doses, leaving out no detail, then closed the notebook. For the next 20 minutes, she sat motionless in the car. She didn't call Dorian. She didn't call a lawyer. She took out her phone, opened the calendar, and calculated how many times the money left in her account could cover $7,200. Then she remembered that the assistance had been suspended the previous afternoon, and she began the calculation again, using the full amount. The answer was 1 month, perhaps a month and a half. The notice from Brightmoor residence arrived 9 days later, by certified mail, and Zelda signed for it at the door. There was nothing improper in its contents. The facility informed her that Ellen Whitfield's residency agreement was being terminated because payment could no longer be guaranteed, effective 30 days from the date of receipt, and included a list of 4 alternative facilities within the state, along with a guide explaining the right to appeal. Zelda read everything, including the fine print, then called all 4 facilities on the list. The first didn't accept patients with moderate stage dementia. The second had an available bed, but required a deposit equal to 3 months of care. The third charged more than Brightmoor. The fourth said its waiting list was 14 months long. Over the next 2 weeks, she called 26 more places. She called in the morning, at noon, and at night, and recorded every call in her notebook, including the name of the person who answered, the price, and the conditions. The only place with an available bed that accepted patients with dementia and remained within what she could afford, provided she sold her car after completing the move, was a facility in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. The drive there from Providence took nearly 3 hours. Zelda called a second time to make certain, then reserved the bed. The final day of the 30-day period fell on a Thursday morning. She arrived at Brightmoor at 7 o'clock. She packed her mother's belongings herself because she didn't want the staff to do it. 4 bags, 1 box of photographs, and a wool blanket Ellen had used since Zelda was still in high school. She signed the discharge papers, received the remaining medication, and a copy of the medical records, then helped her mother into the car. Ellen sat in the front passenger seat with her hands resting on her knees, and during the 3-hour drive, she asked 4 times where they were going. 4 times, Zelda answered with the same sentence and the same tone, because that was the proper way, and because she was a nurse before she was a daughter. They arrived at 11 o'clock. The admission process took 2.5 hours. Zelda sat filling out forms, reviewed the medication list with the nurse on duty, and repeated 3 times that her mother had a red area on her right heel and needed to be repositioned every 2 hours. The nurse wrote it down. Then they took Ellen to her room. It was a shared room with 4 beds. Hers was the 3rd bed from the door. Zelda helped her mother sit down, spread the wool blanket over the bed, and placed the box of photographs on the small table beside it. She returned to Providence that same day because she had 2 appointments the following morning with the lawyer assigned by the hospital. She drove back to Pittsfield on Saturday evening. The journey took 3 hours, and she arrived shortly before 9 o'clock at night, then asked permission to stay beyond visiting hours. The night attendant looked at the uniform she was wearing, nodded, and asked nothing more. Zelda was still wearing it. She had worn it almost every day since her badge had been taken. She didn't examine the reason. She only knew that each morning, when she opened the closet, it was what her hands reached for. Ellen was awake. She was sitting against the pillows, looking toward the window, and when Zelda pulled a chair closer and sat down, she turned her head. She studied Zelda for a long time. She looked at the uniform first, then raised her eyes to Zelda's face. "Are you the new nurse?" Zelda rested one hand on the bed rail. "Yes." "They change people here too often." Ellen exhaled. "I can't remember all of them." "That's all right. You don't need to remember." She nodded. Then she reached out and placed her hand lightly over the back of Zelda's, with the gentle touch of someone who had once been accustomed to comforting others. "Nurse." "Yes? Would you please do something for me?" "Of course." Ellen looked toward the doorway, then back at her. "Please call my daughter and ask her to come help me. Her name is Zelda." Zelda didn't pull her hand away. "She works nights," Ellen said, "so sometimes she comes late. But she always comes." On Tuesday morning, Zelda had a meeting with a lawyer in an office building, 2 blocks from the hospital. The meeting lasted 40 minutes and went nowhere, because the lawyer told her that until the Board of Nursing scheduled a hearing, there was nothing anyone could do. She went down to the parking garage shortly before 11 o'clock. Aldo Renzi was standing beside her car. He stood slightly toward the rear of it, leaving just enough space between himself and the driver's door for her to pass without turning sideways, and he held a folder in one hand. "Miss Whitfield." He didn't move any closer. "I knew you had an appointment here this morning. I didn't want to come looking for you at the hospital. That wouldn't have looked good for you." Zelda stopped 3 steps away from him. "What do you want?" "I want to offer you a way out." He extended the folder toward her without pressing it on her, simply holding it there. Zelda took it and opened it. The first page was a settlement agreement. The Ferraro Civic Trust agreed to cover the full cost of long-term care for Ellen Whitfield at a facility in Providence, with no time limit, no annual review, and an immediate transfer within 7 days of signing. The second page was a resignation letter, with Zelda's name already typed in, leaving only the date and signature blank. The third page was a confidentiality agreement. The person signing agreed not to disclose, transfer, or discuss with any third party any documents, data, or findings obtained while serving as interim compliance review coordinator. "The complaint filed with the Board of Nursing will be withdrawn," Aldo said. "I didn't file it, but I know who did, and I can make it disappear. The file with the Attorney General's office will be closed, because there will no longer be a complaining party. Your license will be restored within a month. You'll be back at work in 30 days. Zelda turned back to the first page and reread the line concerning the duration of payment. "Your mother will be back in Providence this week," he said. "You'll drive 15 minutes to see her instead of 3 hours. I reviewed the transfer records. Pittsfield is a long way." He didn't say it triumphantly. He said it in the voice of a man stating a sad fact they both understood. "And if I don't sign, then everything continues exactly as it is now. I'm not threatening you. I don't need to threaten you." Aldo gave a slight shrug. "Miss Whitfield, you can have your mother, or you can have the truth. No one in this city has ever managed to keep both." Zelda stood still. She thought about the night she had carried the list from room to room on the 4th floor. She thought about the 81-year-old man and the daughter who had asked whether she could take her father home early to avoid paying for the remaining 14 days. She thought about the 73-year-old woman with no relatives listed in her file. She thought about Harriet Sloane smoothing the page of her book across the blanket. 34 names. She closed the folder and held it out to him. "You're mistaken about one thing." Aldo didn't take it immediately. "My mother isn't something you can place on a bargaining table," Zelda said. "She was patient number 29 on your list. If you pay only for her and leave the other 23 people at Brightmoor waiting, then what you've just offered me isn't a way out. It's a bribe, and it has 3 pages. She continued, holding out the folder. "Take it back." Aldo took it. His smile didn't change, but he watched her a little longer than before. "You're still young," he said. "You think holding on to your principles is an act. In truth, it's an expense, and you're paying it with your mother's money." He inclined his head, then walked toward the elevator. He didn't look back. Zelda remained there until the sound of his footsteps had completely faded. Then she opened the car door, sat down, and didn't start the engine. She took out her notebook and turned to the page she had written 2 weeks earlier, the page containing the copy of the decision suspending her mother's assistance. In the lower corner of the printout was a metadata section almost no one ever read, containing the document number, the creation time, and the account code of the person who had created it. She had copied that sequence down on the day she received it, out of habit. At the same time, she recorded the hour and the names of the 3 people who had been present in Klein's office. She took out her phone and called. Dorian answered after the second ring. "Miss Whitfield, I'm not calling to ask for your help," she said. "I'm not asking for my job back, and I'm not asking for my mother's assistance to be restored. I only have a sequence of numbers I need to read to you." "Read it." "This is the account code that created the decision suspending Ellen Whitfield's financial assistance." She read each group of digits slowly and clearly, twice, exactly as she had always read a medical order over the phone, so the person on the other end could repeat it back for confirmation. She stopped and waited for him to repeat it. He didn't. There was no rustling of paper, no movement of a chair, nothing at all. Zelda held the phone against her ear and could clearly hear him breathing on the other end of the line. She waited. 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 20 seconds. Dorian Ferraro didn't say a single word. On the night of October 17th that year, in the 4th floor nurse's break room, someone standing in the corner raised her phone and began recording. She filmed for about 3 minutes, laughing as she did, then posted the video in the department group chat with 3 laughing face emojis. The group had 31 members. None of them meant any harm. It was only a funny video from the night shift. Ray Kessler obtained it on the 3rd day after Zelda's badge was taken. He didn't need to hack anything. He only needed one of those 31 people to forward it to him, and that person did, because the compliance department had asked. The original video was 3 minutes and 12 seconds long. The version that was sent out lasted 1 minute and 40 seconds. The missing portions had been cut from the beginning and the end. At the beginning were the 40 minutes Evan Cordell had spent sitting silently in the corner with both hands trembling, along with the conversation in which Zelda asked whether he had eaten anything. At the end was the moment when she removed the coat, folded it, and placed it over the back of the chair. The version that circulated began with her first joke and ended the instant the entire room laughed. It appeared on a local Providence news site on Thursday morning, accompanied by 4 lines of commentary. A nurse turns a family's grief into a joke. This woman was later appointed to review the charitable trust named for the deceased. Her mother was a beneficiary of that same trust. She is currently under professional suspension over allegations involving pain medication. 4 lines. Not one of them was false. A regional television station rebroadcast the story at 6 o'clock that evening, played the 1 minute and 40-second video, and invited a medical ethics expert to comment for 2 minutes. By 8 o'clock, 3 vehicles were parked outside the building where Zelda rented a second-floor apartment. Someone rang the bell 4 times. She didn't answer. At 9 o'clock, her landlord called and asked whether she intended to remain there much longer. Zelda sat on the kitchen floor with her back against a cabinet and reread those 4 lines on her phone. She read them again and again. She was a nurse, and her profession had taught her that when information was wrong, you compared the facts until you found the error. But there was no error here. She had imitated him. She had been appointed. Her mother had received assistance. Her license was under suspension. 4 truths, placed beside each other in that exact order, created a woman she didn't recognize. At 10:30, Dorian called. She didn't answer. At 11 o'clock, he knocked on her door. Zelda opened it because she looked through the peephole and saw him standing there alone, without Nico or anyone else. On the kitchen table lay the 3-page agreement Aldo had given her in the parking garage. She had asked him to return it in a brief message that afternoon. The space for the date and signature on the 2nd page was still blank. "I was going to sign this," she said. Dorian looked at the papers. "He said I'm paying for my principals with my mother's money." Zelda sat down in a chair. "I think he's right. I've done the calculation. 23 people at Brightmoor kept their beds because you canceled that order. They're safe. But my mother is lying in the 3rd bed of a 4-bed room 3 hours away, and she doesn't know who I am." She looked up at him. "So what am I holding on to my principles for?" Dorian didn't answer that question. He didn't tell her she had done the right thing. He didn't say everything would be all right. He didn't tell her she was strong. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and placed something on the kitchen table between them. It was a hospital employee badge, an old one, with edges worn smooth and rounded, its lanyard removed. The photograph showed a young woman wearing pediatric scrubs, and beneath it were her full name and identification number. Bianca Ferraro. "I've carried it for 4 years," he said, "in this same pocket." Zelda didn't touch the badge. She only looked at it. When she was 25, she sent 3 letters to the hospital board, asking about the inventory in the second-floor storage room. Dorian said. She didn't use any harsh language. She only asked about the numbers. How did they respond? The first letter received no answer. The second was answered with a statement that the matter was being reviewed at a higher level. He paused. After the third, someone summoned her to an office and told her that a pediatric nurse had no standing to ask questions about finances. Zelda raised her eyes. Did she stop? No. Dorian looked at the badge, but she didn't tell me. I didn't learn about it until 4 years later, last week, when you gave me that table with 7 lines. He stood. I didn't come here to tell you not to sign. Whether you sign is your decision, and I won't say another word about it. He walked toward the door, then stopped. But even if you sign, I won't take back what I did Friday morning in the 5th-floor conference room, because the 27 people sitting there didn't remain silent for 4 years because of Renzi. They remained silent because of me. Then he left. Zelda didn't sign. The hearing before the Rhode Island Board of Nursing opened on Tuesday morning of the following week. It was closed to the public, and 4 reporters had been standing in the hallway since 8 o'clock. Aldo Renzi appeared as the person who had signed the complaint on behalf of the Ferraro Civic Trust. He spoke for 12 minutes. He talked about the $41,000 in unpaid medical bills, the financial assistance received by the respondent's mother, the video, and the way a person in Zelda's position had gained access to a man who had just lost his sister. He didn't use a single harsh word. He simply arranged the facts in order and allowed the board to reach its own conclusion. Then it was Zelda's turn. The lawyer appointed by the hospital sat beside her and didn't say a word, because she had asked him not to. I'm not asking you to believe me, she began. I'm asking you to examine only my work. I won't say anything about Mr. Ferraro, and I won't mention him unless you ask. She rested one hand on the stack of papers before her. First, regarding the video. I imitated a hospital donor during my shift, borrowed someone else's coat, and did it in front of 9 coworkers. That was inappropriate, and I'm not defending it. If the board wishes to discipline me for that, I'll accept it. She raised her eyes. But a joke doesn't create 7 medical supply contracts priced 300% above market value. It doesn't drain the fund for uninsured patients. It doesn't send 19 patients to a debt collection company. And it doesn't sign an order cutting off financial support for 34 elderly people with 14 days' notice. She bent down, lifted a cardboard box from beneath the table, and began arranging files across the surface. 42 folders, placed in 3 rows. Each folder contains 1 directive, issued under Mr. Ferraro's name during the past 2 years. Each contains 3 things. First, a printed copy of the directive. Second, the audit log entry showing the account code and the timestamp when the document was created. Third, independent evidence proving that Mr. Ferraro was somewhere else at that exact time. She opened the first folder. This directive was created at 3:06 in the morning on October 18th. At that same time, Mr. Ferraro was present in the East Wing corridor on the 4th floor of St. Auberon Memorial Hospital, where continuous security footage recorded him. I requested the footage through the security department under proper procedure, and the documented chain of custody is attached. She moved to folder number 11, then folder number 27. She read each timestamp and each piece of corroborating evidence. When she reached folder number 30, a board member interrupted and asked how many of the files had been created under the same account code. 38 out of 42, Zelda said. Who did that account belong to? I respectfully declined to answer because that question falls outside this board's authority. It belongs to the trust's governing board and to the investigating authorities. She moved to the second part. As for the allegation that I diverted medication, I would like to present 3 sources of data. She placed on the table the medication scanning log submitted by the complainant, showing her name on 23 withdrawals. Beside it, she placed the system snapshot created automatically at 2 o'clock every morning, stored on a separate server, and impossible to alter afterward. In the snapshot, the 9 withdrawals cited by the complainant don't exist. They were added later. Then she placed the third item on the table. It was a file of handwritten shift handover forms, each bearing her signature and the signature of the nurse who had received the shift, with complete dates. I wasn't working during those 9 shifts. I was at Brightmoor Residence with my mother during 4 of them, and at home during the other 5. I kept the paper forms for 6 years, because that is my habit. She closed the file. Please allow me 1 more minute. She took out a stopwatch, placed it on the table, and pressed the button. The video you just watched is 1 minute and 40 seconds long. The original is 3 minutes and 12 seconds. She inserted a flash drive into the projector. The original video played. No one in the room laughed. The 40 minutes before the first joke weren't part of the recording, but the beginning of the original showed a young man sitting motionless in the corner, both hands resting on his knees, while a woman's voice outside the frame asked whether he had eaten anything. The hearing room door opened. Evan Cordell entered. He testified for 10 minutes. He spoke about the 42 missing vials in the second-floor medication inventory, about who had ordered him to re-enter the numbers, and about the sentence he had already repeated once in the 5th-floor conference room. Then he added something no one had asked him. That night, I was planning to resign before they could fire me. I had already written the letter. She did that whole performance so I wouldn't turn it in. The head nurse entered next. She testified about the 3 employees who had been transferred after submitting written questions, and about how she herself had warned them not to put those questions in writing. She said she had been wrong. The final person to enter the room was a woman in a wheelchair, pushed by her daughter. Harriet Sloan was 68 years old, and she had traveled 35 minutes from St. Auberon to be there. She spoke very briefly. I don't know anything about supply contracts. I don't understand the numbers you've been discussing. She rested both hands in her lap. All I know is that at 11 o'clock that night, she came back to my room a second time and told me not to pack yet. I had already sold my house. I had nowhere to go. The board deliberated for 40 minutes. The suspension order was withdrawn. Zelda Whitfield's nursing license was restored that same day, and the file sent to the Attorney General's office was withdrawn because there was no longer a complaining party. The board of the Ferraro Civic Trust convened an emergency meeting on Thursday afternoon. 9 members were present, along with legal counsel, and seated in the row of chairs at the back were the 7 hospital employees who had spoken up in the 5th-floor conference room 3 weeks earlier. Aldo Renzi sat in his customary place near the head of the table. He spoke first, for 10 minutes, in exactly the same voice he had used for 16 years. He said the decision of the Board of Nursing concerned a professional license, not a financial judgment. He said the Trust's information technology system was outdated and needed to be replaced, that he had proposed doing so 2 years earlier, and that if errors had occurred, they were failures of infrastructure, not of people. Then he turned toward the far end of the table. Dorian. It was the first time during the meeting that he had used his first name. Are you really going to let a group of frightened employees and 1 nurse destroy 16 years of my loyalty? Dorian Ferraro stood. He didn't look at Aldo. He turned toward the row of chairs at the back, where the 7 employees were seated. Those orders weren't mine, he said, but the silence that made them believable was. The room went still. For years, I sat at the end of this table and said nothing. I believed that was how discipline was maintained. People heard an order issued in my name, saw that I didn't object, and carried it out. No one called to confirm it, because calling to confirm meant doubting me, and inside that building, doubting me was considered unsafe. He paused. I built that silence, and all someone had to do was step into it and speak in my voice. One board member tried to interrupt. Dorian continued. My sister once worked in the pediatric department of this hospital. One year, during a very long budget meeting, she raised her hand and asked to speak, then announced to the entire room that the conference table was far too serious to be trusted. She requested that the statement be entered into the minutes. No one laughed. I thought it was a joke from a younger sister who didn't understand how things worked. It took me 4 years to understand what she was saying. She was saying that only 1 person in that room was allowed to open his mouth, and it was never the person sitting at the edge. He looked down at the table, then raised his head. 3 weeks ago, someone made me laugh for the first time in 4 years. Mr. Renzi used that moment to suggest that I had become weak. He spoke the final sentence very slowly. Laughter didn't make me weak. It made me understand how much power I had handed over to silence. He sat down and didn't say another word for the remainder of the meeting. Zelda rose. This time, she didn't bring 42 folders. She brought 7 sheets of paper. "I'm not going to speak about account codes," she began. "I'm going to speak about addresses." She placed the first sheet on the table. 7 medical supply vendors were added to the approved list within 18 months. 3 of them are transportation companies. All 3 are registered at the same address in West Warwick. It is a rented office measuring approximately 409 square feet. The second sheet. These 3 companies list 3 different directors in their filings, but all 3 submit their tax reports through the same accounting firm, and that accounting firm has only one other client. The third sheet. That client is a private trust. The sole beneficiary of that trust is Mr. Aldo Renzi. No one in the room spoke. Zelda placed the remaining 4 sheets on the table. This is a reconciliation of the money flow over 22 months. It includes the difference between the contract prices and the average market prices, the amount removed from the fund for uninsured patients, and payments for which no delivery records exist. She read the final figure aloud. $11,200,000. Aldo Renzi remained seated. His smile was gone, but he didn't appear panicked. He said the figures had been prepared by someone with no accounting qualifications and would need to be verified. Legal counsel agreed that verification was necessary. The board voted. 8 in favor, 1 abstention. Aldo Renzi was suspended from every position he held within the trust. His system access was revoked immediately, and an independent accounting firm was appointed that same afternoon. He left the conference room without looking at anyone. No one applauded. No one spoke to anyone else as they left. The 7 employees in the back row walked straight down to the parking garage, and Zelda gathered the 7 sheets and placed them in her bag the way she would file away a patient record she had finished reading. At 4 o'clock that afternoon, Nico Barsanti went down to Aldo Renzi's office on the 3rd floor of the trust building to seal it at the auditor's request. Inside the filing cabinet behind the desk was a small safe. Nico called a locksmith to open it, with 2 auditors present as witnesses, and documented the procedure. There was no money inside. There was only a packet of papers enclosed in a sealed plastic evidence bag, and the label on the seal bore the date October 18th, 4 years earlier. It was a copy of Bianca Ferraro's emergency medical record. The copy of the medical record was 14 pages long, and Zelda was the first person to read it because, in that room, she was the only one who knew how. Bianca Ferraro hadn't died at the scene. She had been brought into the emergency department at St. Auberon Memorial Hospital at 2:19 in the morning, conscious, with stable blood pressure, and 30 minutes later, her name had been placed on the operating room schedule for emergency surgery. She had never left that building. At 2:34, an administrative hold pending transfer was entered into her medical record. It wasn't a medical order. It was an administrative action, and its only effect was to remove the patient's name from the operating room queue until the hold was lifted. It was lifted at 3:09. Bianca Ferraro was pronounced dead at 3:14, 35 minutes. Zelda turned to the page containing the metadata and read the account code that had placed the hold. She didn't need to look it up. It was the same sequence she had read to Dorian over the phone from the parking garage. The same sequence that had signed the order suspending her mother's assistance, and she immediately understood why the other end of the line had remained silent for so long that day. The auditors found the rest during the following week. 3 days before the night of October 17th, Bianca had extracted the complete pain medication inventory logs from 7 facilities operated by the trust. The access record showed that Aldo Renzi learned about it at 1:50 in the morning, 29 minutes before she was brought into the emergency department. The car that struck her had never been found, and it never would be. Aldo Renzi hadn't caused that accident. He had only recognized an opportunity inside those 40 minutes and decided not to let her survive. Dorian read those 14 pages alone for 2 hours. When he finished, he said nothing. And that silence was what made Zelda understand that she had to find something else before morning. The following afternoon, she went to see Rosalind Ferraro and asked a question no one had thought to ask in 4 years. Had Bianca been in the habit of sending copies of documents to her mother's home? Rosalind said yes. The girl had done it since she was in school, because she didn't trust computers. She walked into the next room and opened a drawer in the cabinet at the end of the hallway. Inside was an envelope addressed in her daughter's name, postmarked 3 days before the night of October 17th, and it had never been opened. She said she couldn't bring herself to open it. She said that for 4 years, every time she picked it up, she put it down again, because opening a letter addressed to someone who had died felt like admitting that person would never return to collect it. Inside were 7 printed pages of inventory logs. At the bottom was a paper shift handover form, and on the back was a hurried handwritten note. Big brother, I'm not accusing you. I'm accusing your silence. Call me when you've finished reading. I'll wait. Dorian read those words 3 times. Then he stood and reached for his coat, and Zelda stepped between him and the door. She didn't touch him. She only said that if he walked through that door now, Aldo Renzi would die while still being called an innocent man, and the 7 pages in Dorian's hand would never be read before a court. She said his sister had spent the final 3 days of her life printing those pages, and she had printed them so they would be read, not so they could become the reason for another death. Dorian stood there for a very long time. Then he put down his coat. 3 days later, Dorian Ferraro went voluntarily to the office of the United States Attorney for the District of Rhode Island and sat across from Assistant United States Attorney Diane Halloran. He handed over the copy of the medical record, the 7 pages of inventory logs, the complete audit findings, and the reconciliation of the money flow. Miss Halloran made one thing clear from the beginning. Once the trust's books were opened, the books of everything connected to the Ferraro name would be opened as well, and she had no authority to promise him anything. Dorian said he understood. He signed a cooperation agreement that afternoon. The price was 5 years of federal oversight over every business operating under his family's name, full repayment of all missing funds, and the permanent end of every hidden operation 4 generations of the Ferraro family had built in Federal Hill. He lost most of what his father had left him, and he didn't negotiate a single condition. Aldo Renzi was charged with 8 criminal counts, including fraud, money laundering, falsification of medical records, and interference resulting in death. The last time the 2 men saw each other was in a courthouse hallway, and Aldo said he had made Dorian strong, that he had taken away Dorian's weakness. Dorian looked at him and gave only one answer. Bianca was never my weakness. She was the only part of me that was still alive. Then he turned his back and walked away, refusing to give Aldo Renzi the ending he had been waiting for. All 34 patients received lifetime coverage through an independent fund. Ellen Whitfield returned to Providence that same month, 15 minutes from where her daughter lived. The Ferraro Civic Trust was renamed the Bianca Ferraro Fund for Patient Dignity and placed under the management of an independent board that was required to include 2 practicing nurses and 2 representatives of patients' families. The hospital's zero-tolerance policy was abolished and replaced with a voluntary reporting procedure, which allowed Evan Cordell to remain a nurse. The position of Chief Operating Officer of the fund was advertised publicly. Zelda Whitfield applied like every other candidate, presented the timestamp reconciliation system she had built herself, and was chosen by a unanimous vote. Dorian Ferraro didn't vote because he didn't want anyone to say she had received the position because she had made him laugh. On the night of October 17th, the following year, the East Wing corridor was no longer silent. Dorian brought out Bianca's homemade certificate and told the staff how his sister had once declared that the conference table was far too serious to be trusted, then admitted that she had said it after losing an argument about the budget. Zelda laughed first. The entire hallway followed. Near the end of the night, she draped his coat over her shoulders and lowered her voice as deeply as she could. This quarter's report is 2 pages longer than expected. Clearly, the finance department has declared war. Are you imitating me again? No. I'm checking whether the coat has learned how to lead yet. He laughed, then asked whether she wanted to have dinner with him. And if I say no, then I'll blame the chair. This story leaves us with several things worth thinking about together. The silence of a powerful person is never neutral, because it always becomes a shelter where someone else can lie in that person's voice. A human being isn't measured by the size of their fortune, or by how many people are afraid of them, but by how many people are willing to speak the truth when they enter a room. And kindness doesn't have to be grand. Sometimes it is simply stopping for 40 minutes because a young person's hands are trembling, or returning to a hospital room for the 2nd time at 11 o'clock at night to tell an elderly woman that she doesn't have to pack yet. The elderly, the sick, and the poor aren't lines of expense in a spreadsheet. They are people, and they deserve to be seen as people. If this story touched you, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share it so we can continue listening to meaningful stories together every day. How did this story make you feel? And has there ever been a silence in your own life that made something wrong seem believable? Please leave a comment and tell us about it, because we truly want to hear the feelings that come from deep within your heart. We wish every one of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye. and we'll see you again in the next video.